We have Danielle Kent back on the podcast, and there's a special reason why we have Danielle on. Not only do I love talking with her, but one of Danielle's episodes on Speechie Side Up was actually one of the top 10 of all time, and we are celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year in 2025. So I invited Danielle to come back on and talk about, kind of continue the conversation that we had back then, which was about reframing behavior, co-regulation, self-regulation. So today we're going to be talking about co-regulation before self-regulation, what the research says about behavior management. Danielle, thank you so much for coming back on.
Thank you. And happy 10 years to the podcast and to you. That's such a feat. And you've done such incredible work over the last 10 years.
Thank you so much. I know it's like the thing that I've stuck with the longest. So that says a lot.
Great. That's great.
So by the end of this episode, we hope that you'll be able to define co-regulation and self-regulation and explain the developmental relationship between the two, describe current research findings on traditional behavior management approaches and how they compare to regulation-based strategies, identify strategies professionals can use to support co-regulation in educational or therapeutic settings, and finally, describe signs that indicate a need for co-regulation and how adults can act as regulating partners for children experiencing dysregulation. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with our introductions and backgrounds, and then we'll dive into defining co-regulation versus self-regulation, describe what the research says, identify strategies to support co-regulation, describe signs a child needs co-regulation, and we'll wrap up with some references and closing remarks. All right, Danielle, can you give us a little refresher on what you've been up to and what you're working on now?
Absolutely. Yeah. So still a licensed SLP, 14 plus years of experience. Every time I update that, I kind of feel like, wow, it just feels, like, wow, we're one more year added on, which is great. Still specialize in self-regulation, executive function, social communication supports. In Vermont, we call those buckets of skills, functional skills. So I specialize in functional skills. I own Peace of Mind Therapy and Consulting and co-own VTAC, two private practices in the state of Vermont. I am an instructor with the Vermont Higher Ed Collaborative, and I am a current PhD student starting my coursework this fall at the University of Vermont, focused on neurodivergent centered and evidence-aligned practices. And lastly, I host the Coaching Youth for Life podcast, and I'm the author of the book, Max Learns to Pause, which, Vinita, you are a resource in the process of learning to publish that book. So you were one of my touch points along the way.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. That's so amazing. Congratulations on all your success, and I can't wait to see what comes out of your PhD program as well. My name is Vinita Litvak, and I go by she, her. I was looking at your bullet point about 14 plus years, and I was like, I'm going to have to update this every year. So I was like, I'm going to put since instead of the number of years. So I've been an SLP since 2014. I host the Speechie Side Up podcast, and like I mentioned, it's our 10-year anniversary this year. And it's also part of the Tassel Learning Network, which I started as a continuing education branch from the podcast. And then I also support course development for other professionals. I'm an owner of a small private practice specializing in early intervention, AAC, and autism in Florida. And I recently became an adjunct professor teaching AAC at the graduate level. And I started my Dr. SLPD program at Northwestern University this summer, focusing on the science of teaching and learning. All right, Danielle, can you share your financial disclosures and then I'll share mine?
Yeah, I'm author of Max Learns to Pause. I'm the owner and operator of Peace of Mind Therapy and Consulting, and also the co-owner of VTAAC LLC.
Awesome. And I have ownership interest in Speechie Side Up LLC and Tassel Learning LLC. And I am an affiliate for Simple Practice and Meaningful Speech and receive commission for any sales made with my code. I'm also a member of ASHA. All right, let's dive right in. So can you explain the difference between co-regulation and self-regulation and why it's important that co-regulation comes first?
Yeah, this is actually one of my most fun activities to do in workshops and webinars is to ask people, how do you define self-regulation? To give people a minute to think, okay, how do I define self-regulation? So for those of you listening and watching, pause it for a second and just think, how do I define this? Think to yourself, how do I define this for myself? And then after you thought of it, come back and press play. But self-regulation is the ability to be aware of and change your thoughts and emotions or energy states. Sometimes I use the words emotions and energy states interchangeably. So the ability to be aware of your thoughts and emotions or energy states and change them in order to accomplish a goal despite obstacles. So wow, long definition, right? Well, the majority of the people who think about self-regulation and think about defining it will say self-soothing, calming, and those things are part of self-regulation. But self-regulation is a complex, ongoing developmental process that we continue to refine throughout the lifespan. And I think that's one of the hardest things for adults when they're teaching or when they're thinking about supporting self-regulation is there really is no endpoint. The goal is that we support kids to develop tools so that they can continue to monitor and be aware of their own self-regulation skills throughout the lifespan. I always tell adults, the very first part of self-regulation is the ability to be aware of your thoughts and emotions or energy states. Just that chunk alone, the ability to be aware of those two things. And how hard is that for adults sometimes to do? Pretty hard, right? Really? So that's a skill that we're all working on, but kids are younger and have less world experiences and are really working to refine those skills through experiences and through support with caregivers. So I talk about self-regulation in 3 buckets. There's emotional, cognitive, and behavioral. And I'm going to start with behavioral. Because behavioral self-regulation is what you see on the surface. The ability to follow rules, the ability to use coping strategies, the ability to kind of function on the day-to-day in the environment that you're in. That's the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Mona Delahook talks a lot about tip of the iceberg when it comes to regulation development. And I connect behavioral self-regulation to that. What are the behaviors on the surface? But the ability to do those things relies on your emotional and cognitive self-regulation skills. Emotional being the ability to be in tune with those emotions or energy states. The ability to enact coping strategies to self-calm. Cognitive self-regulation is really those executive function skills, the ability to make plans, the ability to problem solve. And together, the coupling of those two results to that big, long definition that we talked about for self-regulation. One additional point that I like to talk about is not only do we have to develop that skill set to be aware for ourselves what's happening, but we also have to develop the skill set to be able to communicate those with others, to communicate our states, to be able to communicate our wants, to be able to communicate our needs to other people, to have the language skills and the communication skills to be able to do that. And when you think about that, when you think about all the skills that are involved in that process, it is a lot of skills that kids are developing to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. This makes me think of like when adults start therapy for the first time, and part of that process is just becoming aware of like what's triggering you or what's making you feel a certain way, and then giving you strategies to self-regulate in those instances. And at some point, the goal is to graduate, right, from therapy. I like continuous therapy because I feel like it helps me with accountability. But I could tell that my therapist was also like, you're doing really well. I think you got this. And so like I've been going less and less, and I'll always pick up if I feel like I need to. But I can see the change. I can see the self-awareness. I can see the ability to use strategies. I can see like becoming less reactive. But it seems as though if we do not have a partner that can help out with co-regulation when we're younger, we never had the chance to develop those skills. Would that be accurate?
If we don't consistently have attuned, responsive caregivers who are helping us make sense of our experiences and also teaching us how to use strategies and how to problem solve, then it's going to just take a lot more time and practice to be able to develop those skills if we aren't able to capture them in early childhood. And I'm so glad you brought up the point about the therapist, because sometimes SLPs at this point go, well, I guess I don't really understand. Like, this seems maybe more emotional, and I like to remind SLPs, this second part right here, being able to communicate this stuff, being able to communicate and use language to identify the emotional experiences you're having or the energetic experiences you're having, to be able to tell the story of the problem. What was the problem in the situation? What didn't you like? What did you want? That turns into our job to support the language development in that area. So I love that you brought that up, because it's just a reminder for us as professionals, and in particularly narrowing down to SLPs, thinking about the language and communication aspect, all of that.
Right. And I think that because it's a dynamic process, that an SLP who hasn't successfully, I don't know if successfully like is the right word, but has learned those skills themselves, would be very difficult to help another child co-regulate, right?
Yes. And this is where I when I'm in workshops, I'll talk with professionals. Usually the people who are teaching reading have gone through some courses on reading, and usually the people who are teaching math have gone through courses on math. Well, there are courses on self-regulation and executive function, but in most places, we don't make sure that people have been adequately supported to be able to work on and understand those things really deeply in order to be in positions to support the skill development for the kids they're working with.
Right. Well, you were one of the first people that ever brought co-regulation to me. And that was like, 5-6 years ago.
Yeah.
And I remember I was like touring a school with my daughter, and they were like, oh, here's a corner over here where the kids go and self-regulate. And I was like, well, who helps them co-regulate? And they were like, what is that? Like, what is that concept? So I just thought that was really interesting, because clearly like educators who are working with children don't know this concept or haven't had training in it. So yeah, it's just like a perpetual process. I'm glad that you're going out there and doing the training.
Yeah. And I think this is a really nice segue to co-regulation, right? Talking about what co-regulation is. And I will say, I remember the very first podcast when I talked about it with you, and I was still, I think, in my infancy of the language of how I was talking about it. And we had such a great conversation, but I remember you being like, wait, can you say that again? Like, you were so great about helping me reframe it in that conversation in multiple ways. And I think the important thing about co-regulation is I feel like it's gotten a lot more out there in terms of on social media and even in the school buildings, at least where the buildings I'm in. I do remember whatever how many years ago, I was using it in meetings and people were like, what are you even talking about? What is co-regulation? So if you again, think about co-regulation, if you're listening to this or watching this, take a second and think about, how would I define it? How do I define it? Pause me for a minute and then come back to listen to how I'll expand the definition. So I define co-regulation as the warm and responsive process between two people learning to self-regulate. And I use this really intentionally, two people. In the developmental field, we focus on it being between adult and child. But as adults even, we co-regulate with each other. So let's say I have a really tough day and I call you up, Vanita, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I had the worst day ever. Can we just talk for a minute? And you're like, yeah, Danielle, go ahead. I'm here for you. I just dump it all out there. I'm just kind of sharing my experiences. I'm telling you the story of my problem. I'm sharing my emotional states. I have the language skills to do that. I'm really looking to you for support in that situation, to be somebody to listen, to maybe problem solve with me, but probably just listen, and to kind of match me, to be with me in that situation through what we call attunement. You're attuning to how I am and what I need. And usually adults can get that. They'll nod their heads and they'll go, yeah, okay, I can think of a time I've needed that. And then I tell adults, if a little kid comes up and talks to you and says they couldn't get their favorite crayon, what do we normally tell them? We say things like, it's not a big deal. It's not a problem. But then think about back to yourself when you had that terrible day and you called a friend. If they were to say, it's not a big deal or it's not a problem, what would that have been like for you? It wouldn't have helped you make sense of your experience. It probably would have left you feeling a little bit worse. And the thing to remember with our kids is, again, our kids have fewer worldly experiences. So that crayon does feel like a big deal to them because in their worldly experiences or in their daily experience that day, it was a big deal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that example. Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
And I think when we think about the transition between co-regulation and self-regulation, in all aspects of teaching, that gradual release of responsibility is considered to be best practice. That I do, we do, you do. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to model, I'm going to show you how it works. We do this in all levels of instruction. I show you, we do it together, and then you develop the skills to do it yourself. And for some reason, in the self-regulation domain, we forget, or we try and run through the I do, we do, or we have systems barriers that impact that significantly, like staffing time, etc. And we jump right to you do. You should be able to self-regulate after having this cozy corner available for you. And the facilitation really is a healthy time period of watching somebody else model self-regulation skills, being able to practice them and have somebody respond to you in real time, and then developing that fated skill to do that by yourself. And our kids who struggle with self-regulation skills need more time in the I do and we do phases of this process.
Got it. I remember what I was going to say. I was blinking for a second. So what does co-regulation look like in this technologically advanced world where phone calls are now DMs on Instagram, and the amount of time that somebody would spend and listen to somebody or co-regulate with them is significantly impacted? Like, is there any research on that you know of?
There are studies, but they aren't maybe necessarily using self-regulation and co-regulation, although I continue to search and look. But I do think it's a contributing factor to and it's not the only factor, to the very challenging mental health status in our world today. The fact that we are creating systems that decrease the amount of contact time we're having with each other in a true back and forth, bi-directional, really meaningful, how are you manner. And that really, we can co-regulate over the phone because you're present for me and I'm present for you, but we're not really leaving as much space now to do genuine checks with each other. We become much more systematized. How are you? Most people say, good. Good. How are you? Good. And then we move on about our day. The opportunities to have real, deep, meaningful connections are decreasing.
Well, it reminds me of what you said in the beginning, where it needs to be timely responses. And these other methods lend themselves to like a delay in between a response. It's like when they recommend that the only screen time, 18 and under has is FaceTime because they're getting like those contingent responses. I feel like co-regulation, another piece of that is having contingent response. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yes.
Wow. It's just interesting. I know you're reading The Anxious Generation too right now. I had finished it a couple months ago, but it was really eye-opening. And one of the reasons that my account is now private and like so many other things have transformed out of that, but it's really hard to navigate like technology and personal relationships nowadays.
I agree. It's why Instagram, I've kind of chosen to keep my kids' faces off of the Instagram. But yes. Yep.
Yeah. Highly recommend that book if anybody is interested.
Absolutely.
So what does the current research tell us about traditional behavior management strategies like token systems or timeouts in contrast to approaches that support regulation?
Yeah. So I think if I go to the second bullet point, there's a lot of conflicting and a lot of nuance-filled studies. And then I'll go back up to number one. When we talk about these strategies, first of all, I like to ask people, what do we mean when we're talking about behavior management? Like, what is the end goal of behavior management? Because I've been in meetings where a kid is struggling and the team will say, we need to do a behavior plan. And I'll say, okay, tell me what are the hopes from the behavior plan? And sometimes it's just the team thinks a behavior plan will immediately come in and solve all the problems just by itself. So it's important to know what these tools are designed to do. What's the intended function? Like, what do you think it's going to do versus what is the actual function? So things like behavior plans can be very helpful if they are supporting adults to know how to respond to a child and in a warm, responsive way, and how to teach, coach, and model self-regulation skills. That's the key factors of a behavior plan, is letting the adults know what to do and how to respond, and also how to keep track of data. And those things can be incredibly supportive for a team and for a child, as long as the end goal remains teaching, coaching, and modeling self-regulation skills, providing warm, responsive relationships, and helping kids with opportunities to practice the skills that they're developing. Sometimes we just want to say, here's a behavior plan. You're all set. You're good to go. We have to think about that big picture, as long as the behavior plan is in the context of those co-regulation tenets. Things like token economies and reinforcement plans. I think, again, there's a lot of nuance. They can have their place as a temporary support for learning new skills for certain kids. But some people, again, think the token economy will go in and all the problems will be solved. Well, if we're consistently needing to use a reinforcement plan for a task or activity or batch of activities to motivate, then I like to take a step back and figure out what is making it hard for this child to develop motivation for this. And we don't have a lot of time to talk about motivation today, but motivation, as humans, we are always motivated. Whether it's to the task at hand is the question. And I like to get curious. If a child's having a hard time with seeming quote unquote motivated towards the task at hand, I like to think about what are the barriers that are making this task difficult to engage and sustain participation in. So my big issue is a lot of times with behavior management strategies, we just stay at that surface level of that behavioral self-regulation, and we never go underneath to go, okay, what are some of the other factors that are making it difficult for the child to sustain motivation or engagement in this task? Timeouts, again, if we think about what the function of timeouts, usually historically people have said timeouts for the child to go calm down. And I think what adults have started to realize is usually when adults directing a child to timeout, it's because the adult might need some time too. And there's nothing wrong. It's actually very healthy for an adult and a child to take time to regulate, especially if the adult's feeling incredibly frustrated and dysregulated. And in schools, we are humans. We are not robots. We are bound to get frustrated and have things happen. But I think the important thing is if we need a space to be safe, the most important thing should be making sure an adult is close by and ready to respond when the child is calm and ready to respond. Again, there's a lot of nuance in this. There's a lot of nuance in this. And there's a lot of reasons why for some specific kids with some specific diagnoses, time alone can be very helpful. But I don't recommend it as a blanket strategy. I think about what is the hope here, what is the end goal, and what are the roads that will get us to where we need to go. The goal is helping kids develop a toolbox to be able to self-regulate so that we, the adults, are not the ones providing a lot of external regulation.
That makes sense. I've heard of the term time in versus doing a time out. What do you think of that?
A lot of nuance. For some kids, I think it can be incredible. Like, I think about 4 and under, time in. I love that. I love that. I love it. I think after that, it gets a lot more tricky and nuanced kid to kid. I think so for some kids, they really do need time without somebody being around them or in their space. What I think is most important is that adults are saying, hey, I'm here for you. I'm going to be right outside this door when you're ready or when I'm ready or whatever that might be. I think always sharing space with somebody who's dysregulated can further up our dysregulation cycle. But I think the end message being, I'm here for you. You might need a minute. That's okay. That's cool. I'll be ready when you're ready.
That makes sense. Yeah. I feel like it wouldn't be in the best interest of either party to have both parties dysregulated, right? And having a time in together. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
I have heard so many mixed things about token economies and reinforcement plans. But I think if you just think of your childhood and the way that your teachers maybe reinforce behavior, like a star of the day or if you get 4 stars that week, you get a prize from the prize box. That can be inherently motivating. So as you mentioned, I know that they've been getting a bad rap lately, but I do think there's a place for them and depending on the child and how they're motivated, right?
Yeah, I think for some kids, right, you look at some kids, if it's part of an individualized plan, I think I've seen it be really supportive of students learning a new skill. For students who have really emergent executive function skills, to override that discomfort of learning something new and having to really initiate, that type of plan can be helpful in those situations to help with that override in the new, to engage in the task. I struggle with these things when they're used large scale and they reinforce skills that some kids are developing and may struggle with. So it's some kids get the stickers, some kids don't, even though we're talking about a skill gap. That's where I struggle with these things. When they're part of an individualized plan that can be used really supportively to help kids develop skills, but then faded, we've got a lot of great research on that. It's the classroom stuff that I struggle with, because some kids rarely or never get stickers, and that's really because of skill gaps.
Yeah, and they know that too, right? Like they know that they're not getting the stickers, which is
they know that. Yeah, and the kids who are getting stickers know the kids that aren't, and it just starts to create a climate that cannot be one that's saying like, hey, we're a community, we're all in this together.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then in terms of behavior plans, you talked about it a little bit, but can you go in a little deeper about how they can be used like not appropriately?
Yeah, well, I think there can be, usually it's part of behavior plan, and I'm not going to get into all the aspects, but the most common ones are, right, behaviors to increase, behaviors to decrease. And my biggest ask, and I've worked with several fantastic BCBAs who have really, we've gone back and forth on things, is that if there are behaviors in either of those domains, are we getting curious to go under the surface for how to teach those skills and model those skills and provide opportunities to practice them? So if a child is having emotional outbursts and they say like to decrease whatever that is, okay, that might be a long-term goal, but are we looking at what are the skills we need to be teaching, coaching, and modeling? And what co-regulation supports are we putting into place to do that? So I don't like it to be an end-all, be-all. I want there to be additional teaching supports and coaching supports that we're also tracking along the way with that.
So you're almost suggesting like adding in the co-regulation strategies, because I know like it would probably be more so like the prompting, right? The type of prompting that they're providing, but you're saying like make sure that we're including those co-regulation strategies too. And then in terms of the skills, like I imagine you're talking about like maybe those executive functioning skills.
Exactly. Some of those, that the language, the storytelling, being able to tell the story of a problem. I really am hesitant to talk a lot about over focusing on emotional vocabulary, because then I see people leaning into like, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? How are you feeling? And kids who are struggling with self-regulation, the focus I want to really focus on is, are they able to tell the story of what they need right now? The feeling, the emotional vocabulary, yes, that's important. Or the energetic vocabulary, yes, important. But most important is, what do I need right now? How can I advocate for myself? And not over focusing on that emotion vocabulary piece.
Well, and it's interesting that you're mentioning these suggestions, because like as a previous behavior assistant, everything on the behavior plan is typically what's observable, but what you're suggesting is more of that unobservable. So how do you get BCBAs on board with that?
The BCBAs I've coordinated recently are great in that we come in with a shared lens and really talking about what is the end goal. The end goal is that this child is supported and that they develop the skills to be able to, across time, be able to support themselves in their development. And so the end goal, what I usually ask for is, I know you have a plan, you have regulations you're following. I want to make sure we also consider and we incorporate the self-regulation, social communication, and executive function skills that are needed to accomplish what we see on the surface. And that usually opens the door for some really great dialogue about what we're looking at, the skills we need to be teaching, and how can we measure not just what we're seeing on the surface, but how can we measure the teaching that's also happening for the child so that we can keep track of what's working and what's not in that area.
Got it. Okay, thank you for sharing that. Did we get into the point about the references yet? Did you want to talk about that before we move on?
Yeah, just two great references, Beyond Behaviors by Dr. Ramona Delahook. And there's also, I'm looking down at the ground because I have the flip book for it down by my feet. It's a great flip book that can be used on school teams to think a little bit about what could be going on under the surface. And then Connections Over Compliance. That's another great book that kind of they tie together in terms of thinking about the supports we can be really using in schools to support self-regulation development.
Awesome. Thank you for mentioning those.
Yeah.
So how can professionals shift from a behavior control mindset to a co-regulation framework in real-world settings like schools or therapy sessions?
Yeah. I think this is such a great question. A lot of people, I think, are going through kind of an evolution and thinking about these skills and the kids that we work with. And every piece of research that talks about this work talks about really knowing yourself and knowing your self-regulation, knowing and better understanding your own self-regulation process, better understanding your stressors, the things that stress you, the things that calm you, the things that excite you, thinking about all those areas of self-regulation, knowing yourself. And also your challenges. What is challenging for you? What makes it challenging for you to use strategies to self-regulate? I know if I get really hungry, that's like the hangry. So I always have a protein bar in my purse. I know that working out, it's really important for me, being physically active. If I go a day or two without working out, I can actually feel it in my body, and it makes it harder to be able to use strategies to problem solve and stay calm. So knowing yourself is the first kind of key tenet in this process. Then it's really focusing on those three key tenets of co-regulation. It's providing warm, responsive relationships that provide clear limits and boundaries, providing structured opportunities to practice self-regulation skills, and teaching, coaching, and modeling self-regulation skills. And I think as professionals, and I think, is it okay if I just dial in right now in SLPs? Because that's really who we're talking to. Is that okay if I dial in? Mm-hmm. I think as SLPs, if you can think back to grad school in the therapy room, what was the most important thing that was valued? Having control and being in control, and making sure that you fine-combed everything. You knew you had control of everything. You knew all the pieces, or you at least presented that you did. And I think when we think about helping kids develop these skills are really their own. They are their skills to develop. We are supporting them in providing the teaching, coaching, and modeling. We are supporting them in helping making sense of their experiences and providing practice to be able to do all of this. And when they struggle, it's not about you. It's usually about them having difficulty with that situation, no matter what. We adults can come back to those three key tenets. We provide warm, responsive relationships that provide clear limits and boundaries. We provide opportunities to practice, and we teach, coach, and model self-regulation skills. And always coming back to those three things as the base can really help us remember when kids are having a hard time, what are the three things that we can do in those situations? I think, and also just acknowledging that we're humans, and we're humans, not robots. And we're humans living through a really challenging time in our world. So that's just something to think about in general, is that we all have a lot on our plates right now. And so giving ourselves grace as we continue to develop our self-regulation skills and be a supportive co-regulation partner for the kids that we work with and for the other adults in our lives.
Great suggestions. Would you mind listing some self-regulation skills that therapists can practice or model and teach?
Yeah, absolutely. So for SLPs, if we think about that first step of being aware of our thoughts and emotions or energetic states, we can start to help kids learn different vocabulary for different types of emotions. We can start to identify emotions or energy states in characters and shows, and we can identify what supports the energy states to go up or to go down. We can externalize that teaching first. We can start to teach about external characters, especially for those kids who might not be ready to internalize and talk about themselves. That can be helpful. We also can talk about what we think other characters are thinking. What do you think they're thinking? Then we get to practice some theory of mind or perspective taking, but we help kids start to then connect our thoughts connect to our feelings or energetic states. And that practice can just help kids see the feedback loop between the two. Our thoughts connect to our feelings or emotional or energetic states, and that usually drive our actions. That feedback loop of how that happens. As kids practice more with that, then we can start to think about supporting the internalization of that. When a child has an experience, has a story to tell, then we can start to connect. What were your thoughts? What were you thinking? What kind of emotions were you having? Or what was your energetic state? Okay, let's look at the connection between those. Then we're helping kids internalize that process. And that's the very first part of the process, is becoming aware of those things.
Can we give a concrete example to kind of walk through this? So maybe saying a child had a meltdown because of blah, blah, blah. Do you have an example you like to give? And then we could kind of walk through that.
Yeah. We're talking about externalizing the experience or internalizing. Like, we're talking about other characters, or we're talking about a child's experience.
A child's observable behavior that a therapist traditionally would want to control, but if we're using a co-regulation framework, how that should actually look.
Yeah. So depending on the age of the child and the self-regulation skills, we're going to think about a couple of different things. If the child is very dysregulated, very young, or has pretty emergent self-regulation skills, we're just going to focus on that first tenet of providing a warm, responsive relationship. The goal in any period of dysregulation is to support the child to return back to regulation, because we can't access our strategies and we can't access learning if we are dysregulated. So the very first part of being warm and responsive is important. We also can hold limits, right, in that time, right? A child might be really mad they didn't get to play with their favorite popper in a session and they throw a full-out tantrum. We can just be present. I know it's really hard you can't play with that popper. I totally get it. We can't play with it today, but I know it's really tough for you. We can be responsive and we can hold the limits. We can be consistent in that. When the child is back to regulation, and I always say sometimes right away is not the right time. Sometimes right away, when a child really comes back to regulation, it's not the right time to do some reflection and problem solving. Sometimes we need some space. You know your kids best that you work with, and you know, are they kids who can problem solve pretty quickly and reflect, or do they need a little bit of time? And what I like to tell kids when we circle back to a tough time is I'm going to say, hey, we all have things that are tough for us. We all have tough moments. I have tough moments. When I have a tough moment, I like to go back and think about what happened and think about what I could do differently next time if I were to have that same experience happen. And when kids have trouble with, in that moment, part of our job is helping them figure out what was tough for them in that moment, what kind of led to that emotional dysregulation, is thinking about what happened, what was difficult. And usually for kids, when you say, no, you can't have the popper right now, or we can't today, that's some difficulty with flexibility and difficulty seeing that there maybe were other options, or that they could have the popper another day. So then we can help kids expand their cognitive self-regulation skills, their executive function skills. Okay, you couldn't have the popper. I wanted the popper, but Miss Danielle said no popper today. Okay, I could have thought about a different toy. I could have done the popper tomorrow. I could have told Miss Danielle I really wanted it and see if I could get it. Think about, brainstorm all the options possible to help them build those cognitive self. What are the options here? And then we can do some practice of that. Okay, let's do some practice and rehearsal of this. So we're helping kids process kind of the thoughts and emotions or energetic experiences. We're helping them tie that to the problem-solving skill set to be able to wire and fire together more easily next time when that type of problem pops up. In the moment of dysregulation, though, the goal is to support the child to return back to regulation so that they can access learning strategies, etc.
Thank you for that example. I feel like that was really helpful to kind of take those bullet points and apply it in real time. And I was just assuming these are all done in one session, successive, but it sounds like maybe you get to 1 or 2, but then not 3. So I think that was really helpful.
Yeah. And I've had students I work with of all ages who maybe had something difficult the day before, And I'll say, like, let's break it down. Let's break down. Let's go through the process and let's talk about what was happening for you. Sometimes that's a good opportunity to do some comic strip conversations to draw out, like with the thought bubbles and the feelings. That's a nice visual representation of what happened, to draw out what happened, and then to be able to problem solve together and think, okay, what are some options that you could have had or thought about that maybe you could think about for next time?
That's a great idea. Actually, I'll share a quick story with one of my minimally speaking clients. They recently had a dentist experience.
Yep.
And just happened to bring a like dental play kit from Melissa and Doug, which is really cool, by the way, if anybody needs that. It has like the mouth and like everything you would possibly need or see at a dentist. And so it actually worked out perfectly. And we went through like brushing the teeth, looking in the mirror, drilling the teeth, putting on like a retainer, checking for cavities. And the first go at it, I could tell that the client was a little apprehensive to try some things. They would kind of like try a little bit and then walk away and then come back and try a little bit more. But then the client went to the dentist, and after they came back from the dentist, we played with that activity the entire next session. They were so interested in it. They knew every like step along the way. So was any part of that co-regulation for this client?
I would say the fact that you previewed with this client, it was a preview, right? So they got to kind of play around with it a little bit before. You were providing that second bullet, that structured opportunity to practice self-regulation skills. You were kind of helping foreshadow or help them kind of preview what it was going to be like and what that they would be doing. And obviously clearly providing a consistent, warm, and responsive relationship. So yes, there was that opportunity in that experience for them to be able to learn and preview and think about what it was going to be like.
Okay. Yeah. And I just wanted to give that example because I think if they are minimally speaking, you might be thinking like, well, how do I like have them practice, or how do I have them like reflect back to me like what their emotions are and whatnot? But I think that this is very applicable even for that population too.
Yeah, for all of us. Yesterday I was doing a consult for a student who's non-speaking, and they have an AC device. They have LAMP on an accent. And the student, I also had an iPad because I had loaned it to a special educator so they could do a session with a student who didn't have their device. Long preview of the story. But anyways, the student got a hold of the iPad. This is a kid who loves technology, and it was dead. He couldn't turn it on. I had to leave. And so I was like, I have to go, bud. And so I like gently like didn't peel his hands off, just like put my hands on his hands to kind of be like, I have to go. And he threw his body backwards and was like very clearly dysregulated. And so I kind of pulled the accent device over, and I didn't say a whole lot. I was like, I know you're saying, and then I hit no, you're saying no. I want that. No. And that emphasis on that first part, warm, responsive relationships. I still had to go. The iPad was dead, but I'm seeing what's happening and helping provide the language that can be used. And the BCBA was great in that situation. He's like, well, I think we should be saying like, I'm mad, right? And I said, the focus isn't really so much on being able to say the emotion. The focus is to be able to provide that communication in that instance for them to be able to advocate, to say like, no, I really wanted that, or to be able, just to be able to problem solve together with a communication partner.
Right. Because then the mad part would come in at like that teaching, coaching, modeling section.
Yeah. You could reflect afterwards, and I was mad. But to be able to identify emotion vocabulary, we have to connect what's happening inside of our bodies, connected to the experience of what's going on. There's a lot going on there. So in that instance of clear dysregulation, I'm really thinking about what's the language that they can use to be advocating for themselves, to be able to ask for what they want, to be able to tell me no, to protest, right? Thinking about those communication functions, to be able to protest. No, I want that. I want that iPad.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And I imagine that like even that warm, responsive relationship for someone that is minimally or non-speaking doesn't have to involve the device at all. Like if they know the vocabulary on there, you can model it. But if it's a new vocabulary word, maybe that isn't the time to practice it. Like that would come later too.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
Cool. Okay. Thank you for walking us through that. I appreciate it.
This is for all students, all of our students.
Absolutely. So what signs should we look for that a child needs more co-regulation support, and what are some concrete ways adults can show up as a regulating presence?
Yeah. So usually more co-regulation support is usually, adults know it. They'll say this child's struggling with behaviors. That's the consistent flag. It's that behavioral self-regulation. They're struggling with matching their behaviors to what the expectations are of the situation, which usually means they're presenting with what's called in schools behaviors, which usually kind of means aggressive or defiant, quote unquote, behaviors. And that really, to me, indicates that, we have a breakdown in emotional, cognitive, or behavioral self-regulation skill set, usually leaning towards that emotional cognitive breakdown, because that's the two key tenets of self-regulation skill development. In terms of some concrete ways, we think about adults showing up in really considering those three key tenets: providing warm, responsive relationships, providing opportunities to practice those skills through routines and rhythms, and then teaching, coaching, and modeling self-regulation skills. And the question I usually will ask, again, another question I ask in workshops is I'll say, how many of you have a peace place in your classroom, or a calming corner, or a cozy corner? There's a different name. And it's increasing that's happening in classrooms, that there's a space for kids to go to. And then the next question I'll ask is I'll say, okay, how many of you visit and use and model this place and show what that looks like? And the number of hands goes down. And there are a few. But adults will often say, wow, I maybe did it for the first week, but then after that, I didn't do it, or I didn't do it at all. I just showed them, and then I told them they could go there. And it's a process to identify your state, to identify the need to go to a peace place, and the ability to move back from a peace place. That's a whole process. So we can support kids that's another area of teaching, coaching, and modeling we can do. Whatever strategies are available in a classroom or in a school, the adults talking to each other and saying, okay, how are we going to model what it looks like to identify a need to use the strategy, to go use the strategy, and then to return back. Because the goal of self-regulation strategies are that we return back to the thing we were doing.
That's such a good point. Yeah, I feel like it can almost be like a positive timeout corner if it's like that modeling doesn't take place, right? Or that co-regulation doesn't take place.
Yeah, I think and I think too about the complexity of it. If adults are normalizing these things, if we're saying the printer's not working, and go to the peace place, whatever you have there, if you have like a weighted blanket, if you have, some squeezy toys, using that. I usually recommend peace places or cozy corners have some type of timer, so that we support kids to understand that there's a cap, there's a time limit on the strategy use, just to help them understand that strategies are to support them moving back to the task at hand. But modeling that use, and then identifying okay, I'm ready to go work again. Externalizing all of that. It might feel like a lot of externalization, but self-regulation is an internal process. Executive function and skill development is an internal process. It's in our brains, it's in our bodies. So externalizing that and letting kids see and hear it can help them transfer that skill development for their own use.
Oh, that's such a good idea. I definitely could use that in my home, in my therapy sessions. So
yeah. Kids love it too. Kids think it becomes more expected the more you do it. It kind of becomes more normalized. But when you first do it, the kids are like, oh, what? She's using the strategy?
That's so funny. Yeah, I'm just thinking about what that would look like in our home even. It's just, we give kids, we model strategies for children, but then we do not always implement those strategies for ourselves. So we're not providing modeling.
Yeah. I mean, my kids know. I'll be like, hey, it's time. I need to go for a run. I need to go. And sometimes my kids will be like, do you have to go? And I'll be like, remember, how do I function at my best? How do I show up for you best? Or when you're active, and I'm like, right. So I'm going to go do this. So I come back and I use the word regulated with them because it's a common word, but you could say so I feel calm, or I feel settled, or I feel ready to problem solve, whatever language feels natural for you and the kids you work with or the kids at home. But identifying a need to use it, using it, and then returning back so they can kind of see that process.
Yeah, that makes sense. You did mention that one sign that we could look for kids that need more co-regulation support is like a salient one, right? It's like that behavioral dysregulation. But there's got to be some other more subtle signs too. Can you touch on any of those?
Yeah, so Dr. Ross Green he dumps behaviors into two buckets. There's lucky behaviors and unlucky behaviors. And lucky behaviors are those ones that usually kids fly under the radar with. Usually it's refusals, usually it's just kind of a mildly defiant profile. Usually it's, difficulty initiating, low task, thinking about those executive function skills, organization, planning, problem solving, etc. So those tend to be the behaviors that do indicate, okay, this child could benefit also from some teaching, coaching, and modeling of these skills and being able to better develop the skills themselves. So I think about looking at what are the expectations. It's that surface level. What are the expectations? And if kids are consistently having trouble meeting those behavioral expectations, then looking a little bit more with a curious eye. What could be the difficulty here?
Okay. And then I'm going to get a little bit more nuanced here, but I imagine that sometimes those behaviors could be like as a result of neurodivergent. And at what point do we say, like, this is something that I can support and treat, or like this requires maybe a follow-up with a neurologist for maybe more medication or something like that?
Yeah, I think there's two pathways to go with that question. Number one is if the child isn't diagnosed, usually you see a constellation of characteristics, right? When we're thinking about a pattern, we see a constellation of characteristics of strengths and of challenges. And in those cases, we as professionals, right, look at the constellation. If we see a pattern, then we decide what team to talk to move forward with the next best steps. If we think about the child's already diagnosed, they have a team that's supporting them, then depending on the diagnosis and depending on the unique nature of the child and the team they're working with, we think a little bit more about what we can recommend depending on the shoes that we're in, and the liabilities and the responsibilities we have in our field. For example, I'll say like for a kid with ADHD who's struggling with executive function skills, I'm not a doctor. I strongly recommend, parents talking with their doctor about all of the options. With that being said, the American Association of Pediatrics talks about parent coaching and medication are the two recommended treatment interventions for kids who have ADHD, right? So then we look at what are the recommendations. So I always like to think about if it's a specific neurodivergent diagnosis, looking at the pattern of strengths and challenges, figuring out where does our scope of practice end, but supporting families to continue the conversation if a child is really struggling with these skills.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I think that's a good reminder to just kind of go back to like what's recommended and then making sure that those are both being supported in the child development.
Yeah. And to know, right, that self-regulation skills, executive function skills are documented areas of challenge in people who are autistic and people who have ADHD and in a bunch of other populations that we have the joy of working with. So it is important to know this subset of skill areas so we can just have it in our back pocket or have it in our front pocket to be able to support the development of these skills.
Got it. I love talking to Dr. Diamond Rashad. Have you ever had the chance to connect with her? She's an occupational therapist.
Keep going. She sounds already like a wonderful person. If I haven't,
I really like her. So we've had Dr. Diamond Rashad on the podcast a couple of times. She's an occupational therapist, and she's talked to us about how some neurodivergent children have like cups or spoons that get filled up easily. And I'm wondering if the self-regulation strategies and co-regulation support are a way to help a child be more neurotypical, or is there another way that we can be using these strategies and like changing the standard to be more appropriate for them?
Yeah, I love that question because it kind of rounds out our discussion today. And so because we started this discussion talking about self-regulation being unique to everybody, it's unique to everyone, all of our kids. And in the lens of neurodiversity, I often will talk about niche construction, which is from Dr. Thomas Armstrong, who wrote The Power of Neurodiversity. And he talked about niche construction being designing a life that serves you. So when I am coaching on self-regulation with all of my kids, it is really getting to know yourself and getting to know what environments feel really supportive for you, what people feel really supportive for you, my older kids, what jobs feel really supportive for you, and then on the flip side, which of these things feel are stressors for you, which may cause increased dysregulation for you. And the goal isn't that we can avoid all stressors, right? Like, I'd love to not pay taxes, but it's just something I got to do and I got to get the paperwork together for. But then what strategies can I learn to cope with those stressors? But then, yeah, crafting a life that serves me and my regulation needs otherwise. And that's kind of my goal that I like to think about with the kids I work with as well. The goal is not to conform to any one norm. The goal is to develop a healthy relationship with yourself and to craft a life that serves and supports you.
Got it. So it's almost like that awareness piece at the very beginning of this process involves developing a co-regulation plan that is appropriate for that child.
Yeah, it is.
Very cool. Thank you for expanding on that.
Yeah.
You have a lot of resources here. Let's go through them. I don't know if you want to go one by one and kind of point out what they're good for.
Yeah. So a lot, there's two separate lines here. I have a line for kind of just generally understanding self-regulation, executive function, and then other is kind of neurodiversity specific. So looking through the lens of understanding neurodiversity a little more. And that's important as we think about the kids that we work with, is understanding their neurodivergence, and that while there is a constellation of characteristics that are present in a diagnosis, every child is unique. Obviously, we know that, but it's just reminding us as we go through. So on the left-hand side, I would say if you're looking like what happened to you as a general kind of look at trauma, look at past experiences. For those working in schools, though, I'm going to focus on you first. So connections over compliance, eyes are never quiet, beyond behaviors, self-reg, lost and found, grit, smart but scattered, and executive function skills in the classroom. Those are ones that will really be powerful for you. If this is a parent, if you're looking at the parenting lens, parenting from the inside out, which is kind of in the middle, the explosive child, no drama discipline. The Whole Brain Child is for both, really. I have professionals read that book in the class I teach, and they talk about how transformative it is. And brain body parenting, which is also on the list a little bit further up. Those will help you from the parenting lens to think about the application of all of these. The ones on the right-hand side are really kind of geared more towards better understanding neurodiversity. And two of the most common diagnoses that we work with in our field around this skill set development is autism and ADHD. The only one I like to say and put a little asterisk next to is the autism, what does it mean to me? This book has fantastic kind of fill in the blank worksheets for kids to explore themselves and their self-regulation. It does use some outdated terminology, and it does have a puzzle piece, which some people, including myself, don't really particularly recommend or enjoy, but the resources in it are really great.
Very cool. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing all of these resources. I've read a couple of these books, but I think I'm going to start a new one. As a parent and a clinician, which would be your top one that you recommend?
Have you read Beyond Behaviors?
I don't think so.
Okay. That one, it was like, for me, the flagship.
Okay.
I think you have read The Whole Brain Child, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think Beyond Behaviors, and then can I show a flip chart? Can I pull up the flip chart? This is a flip chart that goes with it, and this can be used, this is for school teams. So you can get a double benefit. Once you read the book, then you can this chart has just so many great resources that are laminated that you can kind of pull out in team meetings.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I will definitely take a look at that further. I think that would be super helpful just across the board.
Yeah. It's going to add on.
So here are some of your resources or your references that you've included. And if you could just tell us what each of them are, are they a book? Are they a research article? That would be very helpful too.
Yeah. So the top 3 are articles, and then they actually lead into more specific articles looking at studies from different age groups. And what I'd recommend is if you want to learn more about the studies that have been done on specific populations and self-regulation and co-regulation, if you click into those, it will set you to specific age populations like birth to 3, 3 to 5, early elementary, middle elementary. Like it breaks it down developmentally and talks more about the populations and the effect sizes of different studies. And then bottom is just Alfie Kohn's Punished by Rewards book, which I like to consider in the greater context of how we're using incentives and how effective are they in the long term, which is very questionable when you look at a lot of the research.
Got it. Yeah. Danielle, thank you so much for coming again. I feel like we have a different conversation every time we speak, which is really cool. So this is going to be some new information for people, even if they've been listening for a while, and I think very helpful going forward in terms of reframing behavior management. Let us know where everybody can find and connect with you.
Yeah, so email is really simple, Danielle@daniellekent.com. Instagram handle is @MissDanielleKent, and my website is daniellekent.com. Hopefully simplifying the process.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you.